Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Metaphysical Media with Stephen and Steve. And this week, we're going to be talking about the homicidal Harlequin, John Wayne Gacy, the man who ruined clowns for all of America. Hey, Steve, how are you doing this week?
I'm great, thank you, Stephen. Good to be here again.
Great to be here as well. I'm excited about our subject for this week, John Wayne Gacy, perhaps the most hated and evil man in America. Am I right or am I right?
Horrid. When we were preparing for the Jeffrey Dahmer show, I watched the documentary that you'd seen previously, the one in which he was interviewed.
Right.
And I remember slapping myself on the wrist at one point because I started to feel a little bit sorry for him just for a nanosecond. And then I thought, how dare I have an ounce of sympathy for a man that did such dreadful things. But with Gacy, you just couldn't find a nanosecond of sympathy in any way for him. He's just the worst of the worst, the pits as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, he's a quintessential bastard. The dude had halitosis of the soul. And, you know, the interesting thing about Gacy...
I love that. Can I use that sometime, that expression?
By all means, John Wayne Gacy's entire spirit had bad breath. And, you know, we're going to be looking at that spirit today, at his natal chart. And you know what? We're going to try to be optimists. We're going to see, you know, was there a way out for Gacy? You know, because astrology, it can be fatalist. It can seem fatalistic. But to the conscious mind, there's a way to work within the limitations that the universe has set upon you. And if John Wayne Gacy could have done that, then maybe, you know, a few dozen young men and boys would not have had to have died at his hand.
For sure.
Well,
for sure. Sad story, though, he didn't.
No, he didn't. And the state of Illinois decided that they did not want to be around John Wayne Gacy anymore. And we have that chart as well, the chart of his death. We'll be talking about his solar revolution chart for the year of his execution. And we'll be looking at the transits for that day as well. But first, let's look at this dude's natal picture. What kind of individual are we looking at here with John Wayne Gacy, Steve?
Well, there's so much we can talk about. As always, Stephen, when we look at a chart, we see pretty much everything there is to see within a person's psyche or conscious and unconscious minds. I think the thing that strikes me first of all in Gacy's chart is that he was born just 6 hours after an eclipse, and we know that when there's an eclipse, the light goes out, and so it's most interesting when a person is born under an eclipse. And now his eclipse was in a powerful house, a house that is certainly impactful, the fourth, one of the angular houses, and it was under the sign, that mysterious and most complex sign, in my opinion, of Pisces. But it's opposed by Neptune itself. So Pisces is quite unusual, quite challenging, I think, particularly under an eclipse. But because Neptune rules Pisces, we have the ruler of that eclipse in exact opposition to it, which for me indicates a very troublesome psyche, a potential for deceit, problems with alcohol, drugs. That's something that sticks out in my mind when I first glance at the chart, Stephen. I'm not sure if we've lost you there, Stephen. I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. I had my microphone on mute. Actually. Rookie
no worries.
mistake. Well, the fourth house is our origins. You know, it's our roots. Astrologers have a heck of a time deciding whether the 10th house goes to mom and the 4th house goes to dad or vice versa. Well, the fact is, the 4th house goes to whichever parent is the most nurturing. It's our origins, it's our roots, it's our way of feeling protected. And this is all in opposition to Neptune, which is alcoholism, which is fantasy and imagination, fantasizing, which is deception and illusion and all of these things. And you know, these were important elements in Gacy's life in terms of his young life. His father was an alcoholic. All of the symbols for paternity in this chart are very weak. And and this is something similar to Dahmer's chart in the sense that the symbols for paternity in this nocturnal figure are Saturn mainly, and it's weak by house placement, just like Dahmer's was, except Gacy's Saturn is a lot worse off than Dahmer's by house placement. Being in the 6th house, I think I judge that as being a little bit more challenging for Gacy than Dahmer's 3rd house placement was for him. But both Saturns are in Earth signs, which I find significant. And both Saturns, they point toward ineffectual paternity and ineffective fatherhood in both charts. Now, looking at that 4th house is very interesting because a lot of times we start out with our chart interpretation, and we're going in a counterclockwise motion from house 1 to house 2, house 3, etc. But looking at it from the perspective of the psyche, we can actually begin with house number 4 because that's the root. That's his deepest subconscious right there. And so if we look at it in a counterclockwise fashion, then we see how Gacy's psyche operates. We see how it functions. The things that bubble out of the subconscious are the moon and the sun in Pisces. And the first planetary point that's aware of these things are the South Node, then Mercury, and then Venus. These are the planetary energies that are first going to deal with and mold the deepest impulses from the subconscious, such that by the time it reaches the ascendant in Sagittarius and thus enters the outside world, we have a Gacy who is bent on dominating people, which is shown by the 12th house. Remember, we're going in a counterclockwise, we're going in a clockwise fashion against the normal run of houses. So we're going from house 4 to house 3 to house 2 to house 1, and by the time the psychic energy reaches house 1, it's out into the world. And here we have the sign of Scorpio, which is the basis for how John Wayne Gacy would have led his life in a scorpionic type of way, which says a lot. So that's just one way of looking at the chart in a sort of a counter, in a clockwise fashion, in a direction opposite from what we normally go. And in doing this, we see that the 7th house is where all of the external energies above the horizon, they come back to John Wayne Gacy. This is how the 7th and the 6th house show how John interprets the world. And you see Uranus is there. So the outside world must have produced very strange reactions out of him and must have seemed very alien and foreign to him, because as those external impulses from the outside world enter into his subconscious, they encounter Uranus. You see.
Yeah, and I think it's extremely noteworthy that his Saturn, the major malefic, that most troubling of planets, is in his house of illness. Clearly, he was mentally ill, but I think that having that Saturn conjunct Uranus, so a really weird major malefic in this case, in that house of illness, is very noteworthy. And I know that you and I discussed in our research the fact that his Uranus is at 27 degrees Taurus, which is a particularly challenging degree in the sign of Taurus, because that means that Uranus was lined up with the in that position of the Pleiades that are very, very problematic. But not only that, both Saturn, the major malefic, and Uranus are under Taurus, which is the sign that rules the neck, and he did indeed strangle the vast majority of his victims. You just couldn't make it up.
No, you couldn't. And in fact, I want to say, I could be wrong about this, but I want to say that the fixed star Caput Algol is also in the terminal degrees of Taurus. So these malefics would be they would be uncomfortably close to Caput Algol, which has to do with the head. Caput Algol is a fixed star that was noticed by the ancients, and it figured prominently in figures where a victim was decapitated. The ancient tradition had it, and I don't necessarily believe this, but the ancient tradition had it that if one's midheaven fell on Caput Algol, then this was a testimony toward decapitation. And so the symbology of that particular point in the zodiacal circle representing the head and the neck area and constriction of those areas, that is definitely significant. But as all of these structures are located at the 7th and the 6th houses, which are important houses for any serial killer, because the 7th house is the house of victims. You see, and we see two particular kinds of victims. We see Mars in Gemini, which is a young masculine energy, and then we also see Jupiter in Gemini as well. The Mars symbol is very, very clear to me as representing not only a symbol for John Wayne Gacy's sexuality, but also a symbol for his victims. Wouldn't you say, Steve?
I would, and Mars conjunct Jupiter, in my mind, is an indicator that he did have a sexual preference for men, which we know is the case. We know that he was abused by a girl when I think he was 5 years old, Stephen, and he fainted. And also apparently in his first mature sexual experience with a woman, he fainted again in the act. He did actually have some kind of brain tumor or something when he was younger, because he was hit on the head by a swing, which again is fascinating because of that Taurus and Uranus. Saturn and Uranus in Taurus, the sign of the neck, in his house of illness. It's just quite bizarre. But I think that his 7th house, ruled by Gemini, it suggests some of the confusion about his sexuality, his complex about his sexuality. He married twice, and you often see that a person with Gemini on the cusp of the 7th house of relationships does marry twice or divorces. So it's just so interesting. Everything, it's as though, Stephen, when we look at a chart, nothing's wasted. There's nothing in a chart that's devoid of some meaning. Every last little grain of detail tells us something.
Absolutely. I just finished reading an excellent book on astrology and horoscopy in general. It's called Horoscope Symbols by the outstanding astrologer Robert Hand. And in that book, he talks about how there are 4 classes of symbol systems in any chart. There's the point-based symbol system, which is what we look at in terms of Arabic parts and planets and nodes and planetary nodes, etc. Then there's the zodiacal-based symbol system, which are all the signs. And then there's the mundane-based symbol system, which are all the houses. And then finally, there are the angular relationship symbol systems, which are the aspects. So what we have essentially are an interplay of 4 hierarchies of very complex symbol systems. Out of such nested hierarchies of symbol systems, meaning cannot help but to emerge. Do you see? It's more sophisticated and robust than any diagnostic tool employed by modern psychology today. And increasingly, modern therapists are turning toward the horoscope in order to better understand their patients. And lordy, if they could have gotten their hands on John Wayne Gacy. They tried, bless their hearts, after the state of Illinois put an end to Gacy in 1994. I think her name was Dr. Helen Williams, a pathologist, autopsied his brain and found it to be normal. She looked at only one map. We're looking at the most important map.
Yes. Stephen, this is a brilliant point you make. Brilliant point, because she autopsied the human brain.
Right.
She was not autopsying John Wayne Gacy, and in fact we can't understand the person through the human brain. It's just a tool. It's like, in my mind, it's like trying to understand the whole vehicle, right, and all of the experiences that occur in a vehicle by checking out the engine. So we know that the natal chart describes the soul, the unconscious mind, and the unconscious mind does not reside within the physical body, it resides in spirit. And that's the beauty of astrology. We're analyzing much more than a person's behaviors, or we're analyzing much more than we would just through observation. We're analyzing the person in their entirety, the depth of the iceberg that's beneath the surface. And it is like psychology or psychiatry on steroids, in my opinion.
It absolutely is. In fact, astrologers can probably divide themselves into two schools, really, the psychological astrologers and pretty much everybody else. you know, I like psychological astrology. I hybridize it with other branches. But, I consider myself an analytic astrologer. And as such, I like to use whatever tools are available. And it's really important to know the traditional astrology because this is the Talmudic body of knowledge upon which all of modern delineation rests. And so it's important to know it. They related to the horoscope almost, they considered all possible combinations of the various symbol systems. And so to ignore their observations would be folly. It would be a dereliction of professional duty. And I don't do that. I'm very, very much aware of the tradition out of which I came, and I think all astrologers should be. But that said, the modern way of doing it is also very important. For example, that technique I mentioned earlier of starting with Gacy's fourth house or anybody's fourth house and going backwards, from house 3 to house 2 to house 1 in order to understand how the subject processes psychological urgings and then uses those to interact with the external world. That's a very useful technique. We can apply that with John Wayne Gacy. Everything above the horizon, everything above the ascendant and descendant axis is his external world. It's how he dealt with the external world. Everything below it shows what's going on inside, which is very interesting and vital to know for someone like Gacy, because with him, he was liable to snap just like that. And, we can actually examine this phenomenon by using a technique called midpoints, where, for example, if we notice his Pluto in Leo and then his Neptune in Virgo, well, the midpoint between these two planets is going to represent a blending of those two planets. And Gacy happens to have the planet Mercury 180 degrees away in opposition aspect to that midpoint. And what this represents is a certain changeability in the communication. You see, John Wayne Gacy was a man where all of a sudden you would realize that things just got serious very quickly, and you'd be confused by that. You'd be like, "Oh my God, what did I say to this guy? He's furious at me. I can tell. But what did I say? What did I say to him to do this?" You know what I'm saying? So Mercury opposed to that midpoint between Neptune and Pluto has to do with issues of lying, issues of dominating through speech and through communication. You see, I'm reminded especially of this terrible story of Gacy's where he played the handcuff game, where he'd say to this poor impressionable kid, "Hey, let me show you a trick with the handcuffs." You put on the handcuffs and you're like, "Okay, what's the trick?" And John Wayne Gacy would say, "The trick is you've got to have the key." Now, pause for a moment to imagine what's going on inside that poor kid's mind when he realizes that the point of his death actually just passed a few minutes ago when he slipped his wrist in those cuffs and he didn't even realize it. Imagine what that kid must have felt like all of a sudden realizing, he has no power in the situation. That sort of dynamic is represented by Mercury in opposition to the midpoint between Neptune and Pluto.
It's interesting as well, though, that when we look at his third house, which I describe as the house of mentality, and I know that you agree.
I do.
People read astrology textbooks and hear that the third house is the house of short distance travel, siblings, self-study, etc. And that's correct, but in my mind, its deepest significance is the mentality, and that south node of the moon, which we know to be extremely malefic. It's a point in any chart from which energy is sucked. So it's almost like a black hole in the chart. We lose energy, or that's potentially our point of self-undoing. And in his case, it sits in Pisces. And I find that the south node in Pisces, when it's very afflicted, as it is in this case, is very troubling. But you put it in the house of mentality in quite a powerful position, at which it almost is heavily, of which it is involved in the powerful fourth house, where his sun and his moon reside, that's really, really problematic. And the eclipse he was born under was a south node eclipse, which is more challenging than a north node eclipse in my view. But then, even if you take the confusion of this guy, Stephen, his sun and his moon, in other words, his power center, his essence, his path in the world, and his moon, his impulses, confused not only because they're both in Pisces, but they're opposed by even further confusing, mystifying, foggy Neptune. You also have his left brain, his rational mind, Mercury, in Pisces. Now, Mercury, the rational mind, doesn't function like a rational mind when it's in a sign like Pisces. So you've got Sun, Moon, and Mercury in Pisces, all wrapped around that black hole, the south node of the moon. And then when you were talking about his Mercury, Stephen, his rational mind in opposition to that very challenging midpoint. And I think that midpoints are exceptionally important and revealing in cases, really cases of murder or criminal cases that we might try to understand, or particularly in psychiatric assessments if we're assessing risk in a person. But in addition to his Mercury being pretty challenged, or very challenged as you said, it forms a square, which is a discordant aspect to his ascendant, the rule of his physical body, his outer persona. So I don't think you could see a more mixed up Mercury than you see in this chart, really. And it's also a very powerful point in the Piscean sign because it's at 0 degrees.
Yeah, it's a Mercury that's trying. You know, I see it as an inexperienced Mercury because it's in the early degrees of Pisces. But Mercury doesn't do well in Pisces because Pisces is cold. You see what I mean? And Mercury is a very fast, zippy planet. You know, Mercury, it wants to travel a lot of ground, and it doesn't want to go deeply. Okay? And Pisces requires Mercury to go deeply. And hence, this is one of the reasons why Mercury is considered to be impeded in Pisces. Now, it doesn't mean that Mercury in Pisces is bad. It means the native with Mercury in Pisces is going to have a need, an ability to rationally discuss things that are irrational. There's that talent, especially if there are other factors in the chart that compels and urges that Mercury toward concrete materialization of things. But in Gacy's chart, the Mercury is rendered even less rational, less concrete by being in the third house. The third house is indeed the house of mind, but it's opposed to the ninth house. And so there's a polarity here. The third house is a house of habitual mind. It's the house of habit. You can certainly apply a consciousness to this house if you choose to, but usually we don't. You see what I mean? Because it requires too much mental overhead. We don't think about how to form our fingers when we tie our shoelaces, for example. We don't think about typing an email. We don't think about brushing our teeth. We know how to do this. So this sorts of cognition, a habitualized cognition, routine cognition, this is shown in the third house. And this is why it's so dangerous. Like, imagine having a malefic south node dropped into the centers of your psyche that deal with your addictions, your habits, your patterns, your routines. You see,
big problem, isn't it? Big problem.
That is a big problem. So the sun and the moon are in Pisces, okay, and these are in the fourth house. These represent urges toward, a need to feel good and a need to be somebody that are in his subconscious. He can't help this. This is in his registry. It's to use a computer analogy. It's in the deepest files of his operating system. And so when these urgings, these solar and lunar urgings, do bubble forth from his subconscious, the first planetary type of energy they encounter in his consciousness is that lunar node, the south node, this malefic node. And the nodes, they have a pertinence toward community and to society and relationship. They're an axis of relationship as well as of karma. And so these things, the sort of diseased, pathological relation to society These things are prepackaged into this birth figure. Now, the ninth house, incidentally, that shows a higher level of thought. It's not thought that's routine. Now this shows a thought that's way more expansive and tries to integrate things that the lower level mind has noticed. It tries to put together a big picture, you see. And so this is why the eighth house is followed. Now I want to mention that this pattern of interpreting the houses going clockwise in reverse to the accepted order, this is the order that the planets follow according to our perspective here on the earth. They rise in the east in the first house, and then they move up to the midheaven, and then they descend down through the ninth, eighth, and seventh house and descend below the horizon. You see, we're interpreting horoscopes in the opposite direction, because that opposite direction is the way the planets really travel. The only reason planets seem to rise in the east and set in the west is because of the Earth's motion, not the actual planet's motion. You see, it's a very important distinction that people always should keep in mind, because this permits us to understand that when a planetary energy rises in the east, it's bubbling out of the inside of me. And it's going out into the world to interact with the world. And when it reaches its culmination point at noon, okay, remember, this is all metaphor. I'm not trying to imply that the entire Earth of 7 billion people, goes through this psychological pattern every day, But at noon, the energy that's our inside, in the 10th house, they've reached their most external expression. And then they descend through the 9th, 8th, 7th houses and re-enter our psyches again. And so the 9th house is John Wayne Gacy's ability to think at a higher level. And it's shown by the sun, which is in the 4th house. So even Gacy's ability to think rationally was clouded by this deep, deep 4th house symbolism and emphasis.
But he's also completely caught up in his own self-undoing, because you were talking more about the nodal axis, right. The north and south nodes of the moon, are also referred to as the karmic axis as well. So I often see the south node as an area in the chart that the person is extremely familiar with. You've done that. You've literally done that part of your chart to death. You know it really well, and you should evolve towards the north node of the moon. And his north node of the moon is up there in Virgo, suggesting he should be more down to earth, more practical, more rational, somebody that thinks things through much better. But it's in that 9th house of philosophy, spirituality, religion. So it's almost saying, hey, you need to evolve over here. You need to work on some of these things. But because of that power cluster of planets around the south node, he just was completely sucked up in that whole dynamic. I love the way you described the movement of the analysis of the chart, Stephen, going clockwise rather than counterclockwise, which is what we normally do when we're analyzing a chart. But I want to point out to our listeners as well, for those of our listeners that are studying astrology, that often they may look at a chart and say, oh, well, here's a trine. So when two aspects or 2 points in a planet are at 120 degrees, we say there's a trine, and the trine is a really nice aspect. It's really flowing. It's very beneficial. But we also have to consider which planets are involved in that flowing dynamic. So I know in our discussion, Stephen, I said to you, I often consider these aspects in a chart to be like the wiring in a building, in a structure. So you may have wired one part of the building to another part of the building. That's an aspect between 2 points, between two planets in a chart within a person's psyche or soul, unconscious self. But then you have to question, well, is that wiring good wiring or bad wiring? And even if it's good wiring, like a trine, you have to consider what's involved. So which planets or which parts of this person are collaborating through this good or free-flowing effective wiring. But if you've got, it's like saying, well, this is a really good telephone connection, but you've got two terrorists on either phone interacting with each other. That's still not a good thing, even though it's a good telephone connection. You're not really in favor of two bad people interacting. And when you look at Gacy's chart, and you really analyze it, you see that there's really not anything good about it, because he has a trine between Saturn, the major malefic, that most challenging planet, and his Neptune, his confusion, his psychic state, etc. I don't particularly like seeing an effective connection between any planet and Saturn, unless I think that the rest of the chart is well balanced. And then you've also got what we call the grand trine, which is three trines all bundled up together in a beautiful triangle. That looks really nice in this chart, but when you see that the grand trine is between that very problematic eclipse of his ascendant, in other words, his outer persona, a very powerful point in his chart or in his soul, and Pluto, the modern planet of death, quite active in the sign of Leo in the 8th house, the house of death. So I think there's nothing really good you can find in his chart.
No, the symbolism is quite clear that this would have been a native who would have had extraordinary and unconscious compulsions toward cultivating power. His childhood would have set him up for this, and this would have been karmically predisposed. This would have been astrologically preordained. Just like a Marine, before he can become a Marine, has to either go to Camp Pendleton or Paris Island in order to undergo several weeks of thorough transformation. Your soul has to go through its development with your parents, whatever that might be, for good or for ill, so that you can become the creature you were born to become. I can't help that. John Wayne Gacy couldn't help that. But, he was born to have these problems, I'll say. One really easy way or shortcut way to interpret the nodes is to simply say the north node you should be going toward and the south node you should be avoiding. And, like you mentioned, I found that to largely, in general cases, be true. And we see here, if that's the case, then John Wayne Gacy, the odds were stacked against him. Yet, nevertheless, think of the good he could have accomplished if he had overcome those odds. It would have required discipline from him. It would have required things that he was not wired to do naturally, such as delay gratification, which, interestingly enough, if he did not have Uranus in the 6th house, that Saturn would have easily have given him the ability to delay gratification. But with Uranus there, that totally changes the picture. It's almost as if every single strike were enabled against John Wayne Gacy. In order, as much as I hate to say this, I'm actually reminded of a verse in the book of Proverbs. It says, "The Lord loves he whom he punisheth." And that Bible verse springs to mind when I see John Wayne Gacy's chart. And now this might be disgusting to say, but I really do believe that God loves everyone, and that includes John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy and other loathsome Grinches. These people are evil. These people are doing the work of the adversary. However, they're still godly creatures in the sense that they came from the divine source, and they do have a divine task. However, it's up to them to accept that divine task. And John Wayne Gacy, he did not. That trine with Pluto is one of the reasons why. It's so interesting you mentioned the trine, how it can be negative. It really can. A lot of physicians who are also astrologers have noticed that trine configurations yield chronic pathology, whereas squares and other quote-unquote harsh aspects yield more acute types of traumas and pathology, such as accidents, temporary inflammations and fevers, etc. But it's your trines that are going to yield your emphysema, your chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, your borderline personality disorder, your chronic pathologies and problems. The trines are going to foster that. They're going to facilitate that. And John Wayne Gacy had Pluto problems. His Pluto is in the 8th house of death, as you've noticed. Now, how could John Wayne Gacy have worked with that? He could have emphasized the 8th house significations of transformation instead of death. You see, but referring again to the midpoints, the moon, which John wasn't very John-like. He had a distinct weight toward the feminine in his chart. John's lunar and solar complex, that conjunction of sun and moon, is in a wide, and maybe not so wide in the case of the moon, trine with Pluto. But if you look at the midpoint between Pluto and Uranus, the god of suddenness, the god of unexpected breakthroughs from beyond, Uranus is like an ambassador to the outer galactic forces. You know what I mean? Uranus represents forces that come beyond the galaxy. Everything else up to like Saturn, they represent forces that are galactic forces. In fact, solar forces. They're modulators of solar energy. But Saturn modulates the entire energy of the solar system, of the psyche, and it changes it for interaction with, the forces that are beyond the galaxy, extra galactic forces. Now, this Uranus, the midpoint between it and Pluto, the god of power and death, is in Cancer. Cancer rules the 8th house of death. So the moon also is tied to death. The moon is angular at 100% power, and it is in a square 90-degree angle to the midpoint between Pluto and Uranus. This represents a man who might kill somebody and not even realize he did it until after the person is dead. This is the type of person who might hire a male prostitute, for example, and then suddenly come to and realize that the male prostitute is hogtied and his head is in the bathtub and he's still alive. And he might, Gacy might let the dude go and he might not. Depends.
Very bizarre character. One thing that struck me, Stephen, about him is that clearly Jupiter is an important planet in his chart because his ascendant, his outer persona, his physical body, in some ways I think his relationship with himself or perception of himself is in Sagittarius, which is ruled by Jupiter. And Jupiter forms an exact 90-degree square to the lunar nodes. So I probably said on a previous show that when a planet squares the lunar nodes, we say it's in the bends, and that is not good. It's a very challenging formation. So got here the ruler of his ascendant, the ruler of his outer persona, the ruler of his physical body, and probably the way he perceives his physical body, or the way he perceives himself, in the bends to, only 1 degree out from an exact square. That's very challenging. And for me, that describes his challenges with himself, his physical appearance. So we know he struggled with weight, and Jupiter, the planet of expansion, is in the bends in the chart. So you would expect a person with Jupiter in the bends to have some weight issues. But I think that it also confirms astrologically that he would have a strange perception of himself or be very concerned about how people perceive him. And I remember you telling me, Stephen, that when he was convicted of all of these dreadful murders, all he seemed to be worried about was the fact that people might think he was a homosexual.
Yeah. John Wayne Gacy lacked what it takes to have a healthy relationship with any human being, and he was not comfortable with his homosexuality. He did marry twice, in fact, and neither marriage worked out well for him. He had children, but we noticed one thing. Notice one thing immediately here. If we look at his 4th house again, we see Mercury is in the 3rd. So anytime subconscious urgings come up out of Gacy, it's going to encounter Mercury, and Mercury is going to want to create relationship because Mercury rules the 7th house. Mercury also is the dispositor of Jupiter, you see, which means that Jupiter is sort of like in Mercury's territory. Mercury is the landlord of Jupiter. And Mercury is likewise in Pisces, is in Jupiter's territory. So this is significant. There's a generosity between these two planets. They have an extremely wide square aspect with this reception I'm talking about in terms of Mercury being in Pisces in Jupiter sign and Jupiter being in Mercury sign. But what it tells me is that Mercury, trying to form relationships was a very, very natural thing for Gacy to do. However, whenever he tried to do it, he would have Mars in Gemini there, Jupiter in Gemini there. He would creep people out. That Jupiter in Gemini is not a good. In fact, I would say Jupiter is accidentally malefic here. Jupiter would normally, under normal circumstances, wants to be good. It wants to increase the good things in your life. But this Jupiter, sometimes Jupiter can actually be rendered accidentally a bad guy, you see. And the person, in this case, in Gacy's case, this is what happened. Mercury is in Pisces. It wants to communicate things of emotion. The emotions, and dispositing Jupiter and Gemini, this is going to make Jupiter's function to subservient to what Mercury wants, which is an emotional type of need. And so Jupiter is going to use Gacy's twisted emotions in forming relationships. This is going to put people off. However, Jupiter, like I just said, increases things. So Gacy's going to have deep pockets. He's going to influence his relationships monetarily. He's going to bribe these kids off. You know what I mean? He's going to use money because these young men, they needed money, just like any young kid. They wanted to work. They wanted some independence. They wanted to have their own things. They had girlfriends, And Gacy, here comes, Gacy was very Jupiterian. He was very jovial, as shown by his Sagittarius ascendant and his ascendant ruler, Jupiter, being angular.
And the deceitful clown. Parading around as a clown, entertaining children, being fun, looking fun, but a complete mask for what lay beneath the surface.
That's Uranus for you.
Yeah, but also it intrigues me that he has Neptune, the planet of deceit and confusion, retrograde in his house of career, and we know that it's through his work, through his business, the Kentucky Fried Chicken stores or restaurants, that he lured some of these young men into his trap of deceit.
Yeah, when you first met John Wayne Gacy, you'd like him. You'd like the SOB. I mean, he's his ascendant is Jupiterian. He's a Jupiterian guy. He's jovial. He's corpulent. He's jolly and everything, but with Neptune in the 10th house, which is career. It's more than career. It's your actions. It's what when people ask, hey, what do you do? The 10th house is the answer. It's your reputation. And with Neptune there, the symbolism is very obvious. Again, Neptune is in the terms of the malefics. In other words, he's in the terminal degrees of Virgo. And, that's not he's badly situated, in other words. It's a bad Neptune, which isn't saying so much because it's a generational Neptune. Everybody born in the hospital for a very long time would be born with that Neptune. However, the Neptune is about to change signs into Libra, so this indicates a generational shift in a couple of years. But still, it's the house position that's most troubling. It's the opposition 180-degree angle aspect between the sun and the moon that's disturbing. But yeah, look at
Stephen. It's important as well that we remind our listeners that even though the slow-moving planets, like those archetypes of Neptune, Uranus, Pluto, even though they move slowly, and Chiron, the asteroid, moves slowly as well, they take on very different roles depending on the house that they fall in. And also, we have to bear in mind the aspects that they form to other planets. So the moon is a very important planet and is whipping its way around the zodiac each month. Although there are generational themes, there can be enormous differences based on different charts.
You're exactly right. The aspects, as you mentioned, and also the house configurations of the outer planets, these are the things that individuate and specify the outer planets for an individual. So even though a lot of people were born with Neptune in Virgo, an entire generation, it is not the case that everybody was born with Neptune in Virgo retrograde in the 10th house in opposition to the moon, in opposition to the sun, etc. You see, so these are the things that accentuate. And also, Neptune is sesquiquadrate Venus. That's a very tight angle, a very tight aspect of about 1 degree. And Neptune is generally a malefic in this chart. It's not doing.
It's challenging as well. It's challenging as well, isn't it? That we've got that sesqui square, which is an agitation between his desire for romance, Venus, which is in Aquarius, which is potentially unusual anyway, because Aquarius is unusual. And then you've got this agitation to Neptune, which makes it even more unusual and confusing. And I feel that that's an indicator in his chart that he did feel confused about his sexuality. He was certainly confused mentally, psychologically. And it's that Venus in his chart that is the ruler, or the dispositor rather, of his Saturn and his Uranus, as we were discussing before. So just a very, very bizarre setup in this chart. I want to ask you though, Stephen, can you explain to people you explain in a great way how we reverse the chart. So, for example, the 8th house in a person's chart is the house of death. Mm-hmm. And the 2nd house would be the death of others in that person's life. So can you explain that and talk about the rulership of his 2nd house for people as well? Because I think that's extremely revealing.
Absolutely. As a general rule, anytime you analyze the serial killer's chart or any murderer's chart, there are a few houses you want to look at that you might not ordinarily think to look at. And the way we get at these is through a technique, a concept called derived houses. And so the 4th house is very important in all serial killers' charts simply because it's a morbid house. It represents the endings of things. But the 2nd house, that's a very important, often overlooked house in all the horoscopes of serial killers. It doesn't just represent the serial killer's money, which is often gained through ill means. It represents the serial killer's attachments, the things that he's attached to. But if you turn the chart, then you see that if you count the house 7, which is his victim's house, and you count 8 houses away from that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, then you arrive at Gacy's 2nd house. So that house is the house of the other person's death, and it's in Capricorn. It's ruled by Saturn, and Saturn is placed in the 6th house, a house of illness for Gacy, a house where external impulses from the outside world, the way people react to him, etc., a house that's right there at the threshold of where these external energies enter into the subconscious. You see, so it's a very lethal placement for Gacy. The Capricorn, for one thing, it's feminine, it's kind of needy in that regard, and it's going to make things happen. Saturn is going to make the death of other people happen here based on his configuration in the chart, based on his peculiar characteristics in this specific chart. And it probably would have happened during his periods in the Firdaria and during transits important to him as well. And the moon is also somewhat involved here because the moon is ruling Gacy's 8th house of death anyway, but the moon is also a triplicity ruler of Capricorn. Do you see? And so is Venus, and so is Mars, for that matter. So all 4 of these planets are going to be oriented toward death. Venus, the moon, Mars, and Saturn, because these are the triplicity rulers of Capricorn, which is the 2nd house of Gacy's deaths. And so it turned out to be that the Venus you mentioned as being a peculiar or noteworthy. I agree, because Gacy did manage to marry, and Venus is a natural significator for a man's wife. As you'll see as we go along through these programs, you'll notice that I use a difference between planetary symbols. Sometimes a planet is an accidental symbol for something because it's in this or that house, like Jupiter is in the 7th house is an accidental symbol of seventh house things. However, Jupiter is also a natural symbol for wealth and abundance and increase, etc. So naturally, Venus is a symbol for a man's wife, is one of the symbols for a man's wife. And Venus in Aquarius is going to be a Venus who gives and expects a lot of freedom. And indeed, Gacy and one of his wives, I think it's the second one, they had a swinger type of dynamic where they would go to clubs and swap partners and stuff like this. This is the sort of Venus that Gacy would have to have. It's the only type of heterosexual relationship that would work with John Wayne Gacy, because remember, Venus is in that sesquisquare with Neptune, the agitation of Venus. His wife, even though she's already letting him swap partners, is still going to be upset when she finds porno mags in his sock drawer, showing, cowboys, kissing each other on the cover, or some young buck on a sailboat without his pants on. You know what I'm saying? She's going to find those magazines and be agitated.
Well, talking about agitation, and I think going back to just the really blurry, confusing dynamic in Gacy, described partly by that eclipse.
Hello, am I there? Huh. Okay, I think we might be back. Sorry, guys.
Sorry, everyone. We both had a problem in that Skype just seemed to collapse on us. So we apologise for disappearing. Stephen, can I make my point about the police following him?
Sure.
Because I was about to make that, and then we got cut off. But basically, I was talking about his very confusing, odd nature. So born under an eclipse in an exact opposition to the planet Neptune, which is where the word nebulous comes from. It rules fog when it comes to the astrology of weather. So you can imagine how it functions with regard to a person's personality or psyche if it's in a challenging aspect, like an opposition in Gacy's chart. But apparently when he was being followed by the police, because despite a number of problems, and I think he was even convicted, wasn't he? But he was imprisoned at one point, Stephen, actually. Wasn't he the cook or something in prison? But anyway, he got back out and carried on killing people and doing what he was doing. And his behavior was really strange. The police said that when they were following him, tailing him, they found it just exhausting because he was so random, so bizarre. He wouldn't be able to sleep, so he'd get in his car and go out, and he just seemed to have no routine, nothing normal in his life, in his way of living each day.
Yeah, but can you imagine people actually, it has to be certain that John Wayne Gacy killed many more than he was convicted for. There has to be a lot of guys out there that he killed, perhaps even females that we don't even know about. And all of those people that he put an end to, they're going to be clamoring through his dreams like zombies. You know what I mean? And really, if you consider the horoscope as being, if you consider the horizon line, the ascendant descendant axis, as representing the boundary between what is me and what is not me, then everything below the horizon, you'll see that Mercury in Pisces is indeed sort of like a ghostly boy type of figure, compounded not only by Gacy himself and his troubled existence with his father as a boy, but also all of the boys that he put an end to down there deep in his subconscious. He wouldn't have been able to have escaped those. And by the time he got arrested, I'm pretty sure it must have been a relief to him to finally have an end put to all of this. I bet he got the best sleep of his life after he finally rested.
Well, Stephen, though, I'm not sure I agree with that, because I remember that Dharma actually said, didn't he, when I was arrested I was relieved, because I was not in control of myself, and I knew I would do it again, so I was happy to be rumbled. I'm not sure, I don't feel that Gacy necessarily felt that way. Do you really feel that he would have felt that way? Because I feel that he would have been just quite happy carrying on, being the clown and killing kids.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know what? With his ascendant in Sagittarius, he would have wanted freedom. Freedom would have been important. I mean, he certainly would have continued with his patterns, if he had been left unchecked. However, I'm thinking that the stress on him. I mean, if killing one person is enough to put me in the booby hatch if I ever did it. Here's a guy. Even if you're a heartless, ruthless SOB, after you kill, a couple dozen kids, that's going to have an effect. It's going to overpower that Sagittarian need for freedom. And indeed, look at his actions. His house, his dwelling place was a charnel house. It was an abattoir. I mean, again, if you look at the horizon line, the ascendant-descendant axis on the horoscope as what's above and what's below, Saturn, which rules over stench, is beneath the horizon. His crawl space, the crawl space beneath his house was full of bones and maggots and various stages of development. It was a stench that animated the entire neighborhood. The cops smelled. Gacy even had the nerve to invite the cops when they were in the latter days of the investigation. It was like something out of Starsky and Hutch. You know what I mean? I mean, we're talking about the 70s here. We're going to have a lot of detectives staking the guy out. The detectives are going to look kind of scraggly probably, as everybody did in the 70s, it seemed like. And Gacy he was aware of this. He was aware of the constant surveillance. When everybody was aware, when everybody was on to what John Gacy was and was doing, they were essentially just waiting for him to screw up. And during this period, Gacy invited the cops into his house for a drink, and they smelled the dozens of rotting corpses. Now, someone who stashes so many corpses beneath his home like that, he has to know. I mean, my point is that Gacy's behaviors were so desperate, so mind-numbingly, bovinely stupid and reckless that he was a man who was literally out of control. He was just waiting for the responsibility of his life to be taken over by some entity that was able to handle it, and that entity turned out to be the people of the great state of Illinois, and they knew what to do with John Wayne Gacy, ultimately.
Well, then his chart does say that he was completely out of touch with reality. So yeah. I think that when he invited the police into his home for a drink, it's just like all other occasions in his life. the man just didn't think straight. He was not smart. He didn't think normally.
No, he
didn't rationalize. He didn't stop and consider consequences. And I go back to that Mercury in Pisces, and I think that looking at how the planets behave in different signs of the zodiac is extremely interesting, because for me it's taught me that it's not necessarily that they're just. It's not necessarily the case that we can simply say this planet is good in this sign and good in that sign, but bad in that sign and bad in that sign and indifferent in these signs. I feel that the sign causes the planet to behave differently, to change its nature. So whenever I see Mercury, a very challenged Mercury, because it squares the ascendant and the descendant in his chart, when I see Mercury challenged like that under the sign of Pisces, I think to myself, well, the brain doesn't absorb data correctly. So if you said, hey, John, look at what we've got here, and you actually have a dog on a leash, and he wouldn't necessarily, I know it's a simple example, but he wouldn't necessarily absorb the facts correctly. So if somebody says, oh, that's not a dog, I think it's a goldfish, then they've got a mercury problem. They don't absorb data correctly. Do you see where I'm coming from? So that Mercury at 0 degrees Pisces, challenged by the horizon, the axis of the horizon, the ascendant and the descendant, meant that this is a man that quite possibly, when you show him a cracker, he thinks he's looking at a sandwich.
You're right. Mercury. Mercury is really misunderstood, and people don't give Mercury enough credit. They don't understand what Mercury does. Your reality, everything outside of you, is pretty much a big question mark. Even though you can feel it in your hands and you can see it with your eyes, these things, scientists know that you can't really rely on the veracity of these sensory impressions. In other words, there's a big question as to what ultimate reality ultimately is. Do you see? Mercury is that entity in the horoscope that maps what is ultimate reality and what your brain constructs from it. Do you see what I mean? So, for example, you put a blindfold around you, you go up and you touch the trunk of a tree. The texture, the tactile impressions of the bark are forming, they're mapping your brain to that ultimate reality of the tree. Mercury is responsible for making that transaction. Mercury makes all of these mental maps of what ultimate reality is. And this is actually what we refer to as cognition. This is how Mercury came to be associated with learning and things like that. But it's not the be-all, end-all of cognition. It's not so much blending polarities like Uranus does, you see. People think that Uranus is like insight from heaven, and it is, but it seems that way. But what it really is it's human cognition that's performed at an extremely fast velocity. It's a marriage of polarities and a resolution of those two polarities. That's why it gives us those eureka moments. Oh, I got it. I finally figured out how 2 and 2 can equal 5. I finally figured out how black and white are the same, how hot and cold are the same, etc. Uranus is responsible for that. Mercury is responsible for constructing an interface between our ego, our psyche, our subconscious architecture, and ultimate reality. And John Wayne Gacy's was all messed up.
Yeah, and his Mercury is squared by Uranus.
Right.
And that brings very unusual thoughts. I mean, in a good chart, it can bring beneficial thoughts or innovations, but in his chart, that's not the case. And as you said, Mercury is adding up the numbers or coming to conclusions with information, and for Gacy with his miserable Mercury there squared by Uranus, 2 + 2 equals, I think I'll murder this kid.
Yeah. Uranus is going to represent Gacy's inability to control his impulses. It's going to represent those sexual urgings, those homicidal sexual urgings to sort of just come out of nowhere. But being an earthy Taurus, it's going to be practically oriented. It's not going to be interested in abstraction. In other words, this is the sort of Uranus that will allow Gacy to integrate a situation very quickly and to understand how to affect the practical details of his crime. Do you see? It's going to be a Uranus that says, "Oh, okay, after I kill this kid, then I can sell his car real fast." To somebody in Chicago who's a fencer. How people fence stolen goods.
Mm-hmm.
It's the type of Uranus that it has an excellent. It's what gave Gacy his sense of timing on his crimes. If the man was not very intelligent, but he had an exquisite sense of timing. Exquisite. The luck was on his side to perform his malfeasance. The luck was on his side, and. But this Uranus, again, is very practical. These are insights and eureka moments that are geared toward the practicalities of life. And that means also in business as well, but also in murder, also in homicide. Gacy, I don't even know. As far as he's confusing. A lot of times with these serial killers, they have a very distinct and measurable victimology. Ted Bundy's famous for the rigid
requirements of his victimology. You know, it's almost as if there was an archetypal victim that Bundy stamped all future victims off of, and indeed there was. But with Gacy, with having that seventh house in immutable Gemini, Gacy's victims came from all walks of life. Male prostitutes, some like Mr. Peast and others were good kids from great families who were industrious, and their only sin in life was wanting to find work. You know, so it's not like a serial killer. Most of the times they prefer to prey upon a certain social stratum. John Wayne Gacy preyed on them all, and he was successful doing this. His career was fairly long.
It's unbelievable. You know, there's a technique in which you look at the prenatal eclipse in a chart. So you take a natal chart and you say, when was the previous solar eclipse? The theory being that the solar eclipse prior to a person's birth is a very important karmic indicator, giving us more information about how life is likely to play out or what that person's path is most likely to be in the world. And you basically look at that prenatal eclipse, and then you move counterclockwise through the natal chart and look at the key planet, the planet that is next as you move counterclockwise. So in his case, because he was born just after an eclipse, you move counterclockwise in his natal chart up to Saturn, the major malefic, and see that that's the key theme, that's the key karmic indicator in his lifetime. But then the other thing you analyze is the planet that rules the eclipse, which again in his case is Neptune, an exact opposition to the eclipse. Bizarre.
Right.
But
and Jupiter.
And Jupiter.
In the
sure,
bend.
yeah. In the bends, yes, miserable. But I like to look also at the declinations. So I wanted our listeners to understand that when we look at a 2D natal chart, we're looking at the distance or longitude between different planets at a point in time. But the planets don't just move that way. They move up and down. They move almost they do move in a wave formation, in a wave pattern. And to understand the wave, you have to look at the latitude as well. Where were the planets positioned in terms of latitude, or how far above or below the equator were they? And we see then a 3D image of a person's psyche. So it's a little bit like saying, well, you've got the 2D view, which is the natal chart, but that's like the top of a cylinder. And to see the whole cylinder, you look at the declinations. And when you do that, you see even more. And that's a technique that I find really useful. And when you look at the declinations in Gacy's chart, I just want to get them in front of me, you see something really revealing, another alarm signal. And I like to look at things this way, Stephen, as you do, because you and I know and are trying to tell the world that metaphysics is really useful. It's not just a hobby. It's not just woo-woo. It's really useful. It describes how the world is functioning, whether that's a nation, an organization, or an individual entity like a person, you, me, one of our listeners, or a serial killer or criminal like Gacy. And these tools are so precise, so accurate, that they should be used to avert tragedy, to profile people, etc. But going back to declinations, the eclipse that he was born under is very, very close to the equator. And that's significant as well, because the equator is a power point. But not only that, Neptune, which we've talked about a lot, was very near to the equator. So a good astrologer looking at his chart would also say, hold on, there is another sign of problems here. The eclipse was near the equator, and lo and behold, Neptune was as well. And so Neptune was at the same level of declination as that eclipse. So you've got this south node Piscean eclipse that occurred at the same level of declination as Neptune, whilst Neptune opposed it in terms of longitude. Really, really strange. And then in addition to that, you've got unusual things like the fact that Pluto, the modern planet of death, and Mars, the planet of violence, and Jupiter, the planet of good fortune, but not when it's mixed up or bundled up in a package like this, they were all at very high declination. And when planets go above a certain level of declination, they almost lose control of themselves. So you've got these three: Pluto, modern planet of death, planet of crime; Mars, planet of violence and sexual drive in a male; and then Jupiter, normally planet of good fortune or spirituality, all bundled up together in a confusing dynamic at a very high declination, a point at which they were losing control. So you really do. The more you look, the more you just want to grab that sick bag and vomit. Because the word for him is just disgusting. He just disgusts me. His chart disgusts me.
Yeah, he's got all of those dangerous points at extremes of declination. And the word extreme is really important. Now the Neptune, I don't have that data in front of me. Is there any way to tell whether whether it's going to be rising in altitude relative to the equator, or is it sinking below the equator from that point?
Let's see. I'm not sure I can tell from this, actually. I think I'd have to run a report, Stephen. I can't see. Yeah. I'd have to run a report that analyzes the movement in declination. But that's a technique that you and I are using in the research for our book.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to mention that because, again, I want our listeners to know that our passion is to show that metaphysics is not mumbo-jumbo. It's not just about going and getting a reading. This is really powerful, accurate, comprehensive insight that can be used to predict weather patterns, look at a person's psyche, predict what they're going to do, when they're going to take action. And you can forecast exactly when things will happen. I did it in my book, and we're going to do it in the book we're working on together, Stephen.
Absolutely.
And so I wanted to ask if you could tell people a little bit about that book, Stephen, because I'm very, very excited about it, and I think that people will also be extremely excited about the work that we're doing with that.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be, so far it's been extremely illuminating to work on. But what we're going to do with it is essentially analyze the entire geopolitical situation that is existing in the world today, and we're curious about how that's going to manifest in the future. Very curious about that. We have definite opinions and ideas about the current trajectory that our entire world's going to be on, and we're excited to share that information with all of you. Now, the details about the declinations and things like that, it's probably important to make clear that what we're talking about here is planar geometry, the geometry of planes, because we're dealing with a couple of different planes. There's the ecliptic, which is the belt of the zodiac. That's the circle that we're all familiar with. And then there's the equator, which is another plane. That's the plane of the Earth's axis, it's the Earth's rotation. And these two planes, the ecliptic, which is where the path that the sun travels and the other planets as they go around, as they transit the sky, this path and the equator, these two planes, they intersect. But we'll explain all of this stuff as we explore various topics. So we're interested in current events, but also in miscreants like John Wayne Gacy. Love studying these guys. And I wanted to point out too that even though Gacy was a murderer, he still was he managed to be a very important part of the society that he lived in. And this grace was also given by that Neptune in the 10th house. Now, unfortunately, I really do think that even the worst natal chart in history can have some redeeming factors, some redeeming qualities. And John Wayne Gacy did not have to grow up to be a homosexual lust murderer, who wound up getting the death penalty. Absolutely not. But in the absence of a conscious awareness of the forces that were working against him, John Wayne Gacy was destined to operate like an automaton, to operate under the programs and scripts offered to him by some external entity, that being, of course, the universe. Now, really, is there one single factor to isolate for John Wayne Gacy, saying, this is responsible for what, for what his life had become. And no, there's probably not. It's everything taken in totality, everything taken comprehensively. What would have been Gacy's best way to escape the chain of karma that he was born into? Because he was definitely born to experience these urges, born to experience these problems. I want to be very clear about that. John Wayne Gacy was destined to want to destroy young men. However, had he been able to sublimate this urge, then perhaps he could have been a great philanthropist. Anyway, I was just talking, sort of got off on a tangent there, talking about our book project, but Gacy the Grinch sort of pulled me right back into where we were going here, and I was hoping we could actually look at some of the salient features of his execution date.
Yes.
How would you like to do that?
I would love to do that, Stephen, because that is a brilliant way of demonstrating to our listeners, whether they're listening live or they're listening to the archive this week, next week, or even next year, we can show that progressed astrology, including transits, etc., and eclipses, or the eclipse series, basically describe what's going to happen.
Absolutely. I wanted to... You actually have a chart with the progressions and the transits of his execution date. Would you like to talk a little bit about some of the more salient features of those charts, Steve?
I will do, actually, Stephen. I need to just run it. So he was executed on May the 10th, 1994.
Right.
So I don't think we know the time, but I'm just going to use midday. So just for everyone's reference, what we do here is we take that date, May the 10th, 1994. So let me double check that's correct. Yes. And then we progress his chart. So we'll see through hermetic progressions that the natal planets move to other positions. And when we contrast those progressed planets with each other and with their natal positions, we see deep underlying conditions that can get triggered. Oh, Stephen, you were saying he was executed at 12:50 a.m.?
Yeah, the official word was given at 12:58, so I calibrated for typical bureaucratic slowness.
Okay, let's see, 12:50 a.m. Was that actually on the 10th, though, or was that the 9th?
It was on the 10th.
Or the 11th, rather. The 10th, it was.
Yeah.
Okay, let me put in the transits. So the transits, just for everyone's reference, transiting planets will trigger those underlying progressions, those pockets, deep pockets of circumstance. So let me see. Do you want me to email you the chart, Stephen?
I have it already.
You have it?
I do have it.
Two things that really stick out like a sore thumb, which are just unbelievable. You can't make this up. You couldn't reverse engineer this chart. Transiting Saturn, the major malefic, ancient planet of death and suffering or abuse, many of these things that Gacy lived for and represented, it was right on top of his progressed south node. In other words, ready, poised to suck the life out of him. And he was killed by lethal injection, wasn't he?
He was. It's kind of a botched execution, thankfully. They had to the IV line got clogged. And I hope it hurt, son of a bitch.
Transiting Pluto, modern planet of death, in its own sign of Scorpio, was in exact opposition to, or not exact opposition, but very close opposition to his natal Saturn, his natal Uranus, and in fact to the transiting South Node. Transiting South Node conjunct his natal Saturn, ready also to suck the life out of the sucker.
Yep, and you know what? By solar revolution technique, that also was pointing toward a death for that year. Because, if for those not familiar with the solar return technique, every year the sun comes back to occupy the exact same position that it occupied on the day you were born, and so astrologers can take that position of the sun. For example, my son. Or Gacy's sun is in 25 degrees and X minutes of Pisces,
Okay, every year when the sun comes back to that particular position, then if you cast a chart for that moment, it shows what Gacy's year will be like. Well, if you do a solar return for the year of his death, Leo rises. Therefore, the sun, which rules Leo, is what we refer to as Lord of the Year. And the Lord of that year is in the 8th house. And medieval astrologers would have shuddered at seeing that. That would have been
Stephen, would they have said, "Oh yay, oh yay"?
Yeah.
This man will be noticed for killing people.
Oh, for sure. They would not have liked the position of the ascendant ruler. That would have been a big no-no. The ascendant ruler being peregrine and in the bends and, not in good shape from the aspects. They would have looked at Mars. They would have seen the Mars ruling the 12th house and being angular and peregrine, and they would not have liked that. So for sure, and they would have noticed the 2nd house. Modern astrologers wouldn't. The modern astrologers would have focused probably on the 7th house, but the medieval guys, they would have derived the 2nd house as being the house of death for the partner, and they would have looked at this. They would have derived houses for this guy's partners as a matter of routine. Medieval astrologers they're very much like Vedic astrologers of today. When you went to go see a medieval guy, he would have cast a lot of charts for you. A lot. Just based on your natal chart. He would have used the moon as an ascendant and cast a chart on that point and gotten all sorts of information about your mom. Done the same with the sun and various other Arabic parts. So, these guys, man, the ancient techniques are really, really, really comprehensive and hard, which is a long-winded way of saying, yeah, they would have agreed Gacy was screwed from the beginning.
Yeah. Horrid ending to a horrid existence. I think also when you go back to the natal chart and remember that it basically describes all of the potential in a person's life, so what's most likely to happen, what's possible. His natal Saturn and his Uranus square Neptune, which suggests that his ending might be or might involve anesthesia or drugs, which it certainly did.
Right. Yeah. If you look at, to forecast his end, one really simple prediction method that anybody can use is to use the Arabic method of directing by triplicities. Very, very economical way. You don't forecasting. You don't have to cast any other chart, and so what happens is you have to be aware of triplicity rulers. You have to understand the 3 triplicity rulers that rule every sign. And so for Gacy's 8th house of death, we have Cancer. Okay, that's a water sign, and Gacy was born at night. So the triplicity rulers for night charts in Cancer, first off, it's going to be Mars. Second is going to be Venus, and third, the Moon. So the Moon rules the final third part of Gacy's death, and that is actually death. The Moon is in Pisces. Pisces is a sign of anesthesia, intoxicants, drugs, etc. Neptune rules it. Neptune pertains to these things. Also, we look at the 4th house, which is anybody's ending, and we look at the final triplicity ruler for the 4th house, which also turns out to be the Moon, if I'm not mistaken. And boom, we have the same story. So, yeah, the guy would have had a watery ending. We'll say that much. A Piscean ending. We'll say that much. And the good thing is about Pisces, it's the end of a cycle. So hopefully when this guy reincarnates, he won't be such a douchebag. That's what I'm thinking. Are you still with me, Steve?
Yes, I am. I was just saying I'm not sure about that. But I was doing it with my mic on, which is not helpful. But I'm not sure about that because, Stephen, I don't believe that we just transform when we transition to spirit. I believe that we go there as we are. Admittedly, we don't take the physical body, but we go there as we are and we continue to evolve. And right. I doubt that he would evolve enough or sufficiently.
Well, I think that, I'm not necessarily a Buddhist or anything like that, but I have sort of a philosophical approach to religion. And one doctrine of Hinduism and by extension, I suppose, Buddhism that I like is the idea of what they call Sinchit karma,
which is karma, basically.
Well, it's a combination of sin and shit.
No.
I couldn't resist that one.
It would be son of shit karma for Gacy. That sin shit karma is when you get a break from your karmic burdens. You know what I mean? When you have a life. In other words, the idea is that if you give credence to this notion, there's no sort of serial karmic burden. There's no, you don't deal with karma serially in lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. You could take a break. In other words, you generate karma in this lifetime. Maybe you'll deal with it next. Maybe you'll deal with it 5,000 incarnations from now. Who knows? What we can be sure of is that you'll deal with it. You see. So that's a distinction of karma. So I think it's possible that in his next lifetime, Gacy might get a break. But for sure, the karmic indications of this chart, shown by the nodal axis especially, that's going to come up again. That's going to come up. It's going to come up again for the soul that is Gacy, and it's going to come up again at the worse intensity than it did this time, because he didn't deal with it properly this time. So he's not going to be able to pass the course until he deals with it successfully. He's not going to. The teacher, God, isn't going to pass him to maintain his sports eligibility or because it's politically correct to do so. He will flunk you over and over and over and over and over again until your hard head finally gets it. And that's what's going to happen again.
Well, on the subject of flunking, I forgot to mention the eclipses that occurred prior to his execution. So just for everybody's reference, we can look at eclipses as they occur, transiting eclipses, and we can see where they fall in the chart, in a person's progress chart, because they show a theme that is building, and indeed, when you analyse the 4 eclipses prior to his execution, they show that he was on borrowed time.
He was desperate, too. The guy wriggled like a worm on a hook to try to get mercy. Mercy that he didn't show those other poor boys when they were bound helpless in front of him. He had the gall, the despicable gall to paint himself, just like Dahmer did. And just like in Dahmer's case, it was equally spurious and false. Yeah, these people are cowards at heart, and when they're backed into a corner, they're going to act in cowardly fashion and show their true colors. And that's what Gacy did. He didn't go out like a man. He went out like what he was, which is a coward and a cream puff who can only dominate people who can only dominate people. And I don't say that as a reference to his gayness, because Gacy, he didn't understand the idea that homosexuality could be virile and masculine. For him, he straitjacketed himself into this concept of homosexuality being, enacting itself along traditional gender lines, which was part of what snarled up his sexuality, I think. He couldn't conceive of himself as being a happily gay man in a healthy relationship. For him, this was,
Yeah, did we? I don't think we said too much about his childhood, Stephen, actually. So we know that he was a real mummy's boy. His mum seemed to really protect him, and his father was something of a bully and was forever criticising him and saying, you're gay, you're queer, this, that, and the other. But we had a discussion, I think, in the Jeffrey Dahmer show about nature versus nurture, or is it the other way around? Nurture versus nature? I can't remember off the top of my head. But we discussed that briefly with Dahmer. But yes. I think you and I agreed that his sexuality, John Wayne Gacy's sexuality, looking at his chart, was bisexual, but with a strong leaning towards men, and that's what he seemed to bring into the world, although his father bullying him probably didn't help him as he evolved and grew up and matured.
Yeah, I mean, psychologically, with that weak father, and it's symbolized by Saturn being in a cadent house, the 6th house, couple that with the mother. Look at the mother, angular. The moon, that moon is a powerful moon. So mom would have been the towering force in his life. And this could have, I'm no psychologist, but I tell you one thing, I think the entire world of psychology has gotten it wrong. It's not nature versus nurture. It's both. It's nature and nurture. My thinking on the matter is that the soul incarnates into material that can provide it both. It incarnates into the nature, in other words, the environment that can produce what's shown in the birth chart. In other words, John Wayne Gacy couldn't have been born to my parents or your parents because his soul would have been inappropriate. Would have been improperly matched with that nature. Do you see? Oh, I'm sorry, and also with that nurture. So the soul went to where it had to go. Now, as to whether or not Gacy had any control or direction over this, or whether God or some other entity did, we can only speculate about that. But
Well, I have a slightly different view, Steve. I hear where you're coming from, and I respect your opinion. My view is that it's when it comes to sexuality, it's more, and I say this as a gay guy, but
right.
my view is it's more nature than nurture, but I acknowledge that the way we're nurtured or not nurtured certainly has a profound impact upon the development of the psyche. So.
Yeah.
The relationship we have with the father and the mother, the male archetype and the female archetype, our first and most important experiences with those archetypes in this lifetime, that does have an impact upon us as we develop. And I think particularly it has the dynamic we experience with each parent and the dynamics we observe between them has a significant impact over our psychological understanding of relationships.
Yeah.
So if a child grows up seeing the parents at each other's throats, with an extremely challenging relationship, then they can develop an unconscious understanding or stance that relationships are very difficult. So I'm kind of more towards nature than nurture, but I absolutely acknowledge the huge importance of our formative experiences in the development of our psyches.
Right.
But you said, maybe he couldn't choose. I think you can always choose. I'm gay. I could choose to find a female and be with a female. If you're free to choose, of course you can choose.
Right.
The question for me was, is that something I would want? The answer was no, because I was attracted to guys. Love women, and I can say to you, gosh, that's an attractive girl over there, but I don't want to sleep with her.
Right.
But also for me, it came down to an ethical consideration, because I thought, well, I know that I'm attracted to men, and if I just get married, I'm potentially making some great woman's life a lie. I'm stealing it from her, because I'm not necessarily being open about who I am.
Yeah, and you know what? I think that it's also a mixture. I think some people are born homosexual or bisexual or in any of the different any of the various gender assignments that we have in this day and age. And, in this day and age, I say, there have always been intersex people who have straddled the line of both genders. The whole concept of gender roles is really, really fascinating, and it touches upon John Wayne Gacy. I think it's both possible. I think it's possible for a heterosexual to choose a homosexual lifestyle, and obviously it's possible for somebody to be born that way. John Wayne Gacy, I think that nature and nurture both combine to produce his sexuality. And I think that the whole arena of sexuality was the launching off point of many areas of his life. If you notice, his fifth house of sexuality is in Aries, which Aries always represents a burst of ego energy. Do you see what I mean? It's Aries. It doesn't matter where Aries is at in your chart. It's always going to represent a beginning. The very nature, the idea of beginningness is inherent in the definition of Aries, is it not? And so we find Aries on the fifth house cusp, which is a very ego-oriented house, which is a house that shows how a person plays, not necessarily wastes time, but what that person does to express himself, and it has to do with the sexuality as well. With Aries that's where almost like a beginning of a life cycle type of energy is going to emanate from, and it's going to find a matrix, a nurturing vessel in Taurus.
which is in the 6th house of sickness, unfortunately. So, it's obvious looking at Gacy's chart that this is a guy for whom relationships are going to be the arena of struggle in this incarnation. With the nodal axis, which is inherently geared toward community and relationship, with that nodal axis.
Steve, I was just laughing because they literally, pardon the pun, they were about struggle.
Yeah.
Physical struggle.
Absolutely. And that was part of the pleasure for Gacy as well. But, we're coming down to 20 minutes left in the show here, and we got a pretty good show lined up for next week. Did you want to talk about that some?
Absolutely. So next week, we will split the show in two. We'll cover the New York Stock Exchange in the first hour, and we'll analyze the New York Stock Exchange as an entity. It has a well-recognized natal chart, so we'll be talking about its nature. We may, if we have time and if we feel inclined to do so, actually look at some of the more significant events in the life of the New York Stock Exchange. We may look out into the future if there are things that we feel are particularly important, or we might reserve predictions on the New York Stock Exchange for a future show. But in the second half of the show, we are going to take some calls from listeners about their questions. So in other words, we will answer questions that they bring to us because we want to be of service to people as well. And obviously, Stephen and I make our livings working with clients, helping them to address their opportunities and the challenges that come up in life. But Stephen, do you want to mention perhaps some guidelines for callers that will want to call in next week? Oh, actually, it's not next week; it's Friday.
Yes, it is this Friday. Well, absolutely. If you want us to look at a birth figure, and I tell you what, Steve, I don't have any problem with whipping out the tarot cards for people if we're going to take calls. How do you feel about that? Telling people, do you feel like doing some tarot if people call in as well?
Happy to use both, either or. I'm happy to use either tarot for a person or to look at their chart instead, or to use both. I don't mind. I'm open to just seeing what happens, Stephen, if you are.
Okay, well, for those of you who would like us to discuss your natal figure on the air and would like to call us in and ask us specific questions about it, such as, why can't I find any luck in love? Or, why is it that I never really seem to get a really solid financial hold on life, etc., then call us in, email your birth data to Stephen at thegingerpsychic.com or inquiries at stephenframpton.com, and that's Stephen with a V. And then email us your birth data. We'd love it if you could have your birth time that's accurate. If it's not accurate, still send it. Maybe we can do something with it. If if it's something like, well, Mom said that I was born sometime around 6. That's fine. We can work with that. I can, with midpoints and other things like that, Steve, we can still extract a pretty intelligible outlook for such a birth chart. And also, if you don't want to share your birth data, and if we have the time, you can always feel free to call in, and we can, ask us, let us know what the problem is, and we can use tarot to address that. We do tarot as well, and we're going to have some shows in the future that are oriented specifically toward tarot and toward teaching people to get a better result from tarot, because, astrology is the golden key to understanding the universe, but tarot is the silver one.
Yeah, I love that, the golden key and the silver key.
Yeah.
C.C. Zane, any quote of C.C. Zane's lights me up, Stephen.
Yeah.
I love the Church of Light. Learned a lot from Zane's work.
I tell you what, the Church of Light's Egyptian tarot deck is a deck that really does need to be showcased on this show and demonstrated with many, many spreads. It is absolutely, hands down, the most powerful deck I've ever used. It's of a class almost totally different from the more Kabbalistic-based tarot systems of the Rider-Waite deck and the Hermetic tarot and the Thoth tarot deck, etc. And I would love to take some shows to illustrate the principles of the Brotherhood of Light's Egyptian tarot deck and raise awareness about this powerful tool. But what you're going to learn about the tarot from this show is going to free you from using any particular deck. You'll be able to get excellent results from using just regular playing cards when we get done with you.
Yes, and it would be great to have some shows periodically on tarot as well, just to demonstrate that the tarot correlates with astrology, the planets, the signs of the zodiac and their decans or decanates, the two completely interwoven systems. And it would be great to show people as well how both of those metaphysical systems correlate with the Hebrew alphabet, with musical notes, colors, numbers, even in numerology, etc., and that the world really is this incredible prism that we can look through from different angles. But I think what's most exciting for me when I look at all these tools, Stephen, is the understanding, the appreciation that there is an incredible intelligence at work.
Yeah, and you know, it never fails to give me goosebumps that you know, sometimes I'm struck by the recognition that this sense that, you know, that this intelligence is external to me. That's a big deal for me. You know what I mean? As someone who's extremely rational, you know, the idea of an external intelligence, an external force, an external observer, man, that's really as close to religion as you can possibly get. It's closer than a lot of so-called orthodox religious vehicles have ever brought me before in my life. So, yeah, absolutely, tarot has changed my life radically. I'm not. That's not BS. It's had practical, tangible benefit in my life, and I'm a passionate advocate for the tarot. And it's going to come out in this show through a variety of spreads. So next week, if you want to call in, you don't know your birth date for whatever reason, you don't feel like giving it to us, because believe me, but your birth date in our hands is in any astrologer's hands is just as revealing as a social security number. You know, it's when we have the horoscope of someone in front of us, we know what sort of person we're dealing with. So if you don't feel like giving us your birth data, call up with a tarot question. We'll answer it using tarot. But I would like to add that our delineation of the New York Stock Exchange next week is going to be a good show to use as a basis for all the speculations that we're going to make in the future off of that chart. So in the archives, it's going to be a show that you're going to want to refer to construct a sort of symbolic key, because we're going to use that symbolic key to try to understand how the market's going to perform from an astrological viewpoint in the future. Just as we'll look at world dynamics and events. Right. You know, for example, you know, we've talked about what Mars, for example, means in Russia's chart. So when we see Mars in a prognosticatory context, in a forecasting context, then it's going to carry all of its natal meanings with it. So trying to forecast without understanding those natal meanings is very premature. This coming Friday, we're going to understand the natal meanings of the New York Stock Exchange, with the idea of preparing to understand its future behavior. And that's what we've got going for next week. So as you can see, guys, so far we love to do current events topics, and we love to explore bizarre and compelling personalities like those of Mr. Dahmer, those of John Wayne Gacy. We're going to, you know, we're not so negative. We're going to examine some spiritually uplifting people, I'm sure, in the future. But you know what? The birth charts that look like God got a bloody nose and then just, you know, sort of use that person's birth figure as a blood rag, those charts are very illuminating. Those charts are very educational, because, you know, all of us are born with difficulties in our chart, and we all need to have. Everyone has a bogey in their chart. It's just that Gacy just only had a big pile of snot. There was not really anything else. Yeah. Gacy's the negative features in Gacy's chart were a bit overwhelming. But I mean, with the moon and the sun
conjunct in Pisces, this was potentially a placement of great sensitivity and mercy. But, typically with Pisces, we find they fall into two types, the primitive type and the more advanced type. John Wayne Gacy strikes me way much more as the primitive type of Pisces. And for this type, they're going to, be inclined towards drug abuse. They're not going to have the spiritual sophistication of the more advanced type of Pisces. They're going to evolve into that more advanced kind of Pisces if the life supports that evolution. But John Wayne Gacy did not. But notice that he did have some artistic ability, as much as it puckers my soul to say that. The man did have some artistic ability. It was crude. It was the sort of artistic ability you'd expect from a particularly bright elephant cub, but it was still artistic ability.
Or elephant calf, I should say.
Exciting. Well, Stephen, before we do wrap up short in a moment, I wanted to remind people where they can find us. So if you want to contact Stephen, you can contact him via his website, thegingerpsychic.com. That's thegingerpsychic.com. And Stephen has an absolutely fascinating blog on there. If you really want to start understanding metaphysics, and understanding it in the context of real people, real world events, then you've got to subscribe to his blog. Every time he does one, I get them printed at Staples, and I relish reading them with a coffee or a nice glass of wine. They're absolutely brilliant. And even if you've got lots of experience in metaphysics, you'll learn even more through Stephen's perspective. So check out his site, thegingerpsychic.com. He's on Facebook as well, and I am Stephen Frampton. My website is stephenframpton.com, and that's Stephen with a V, and Frampton is the same as Peter Frampton, as everyone always asks me in the States, but unfortunately I don't have his bank balance. And you can join me on Facebook as well. We also have a Facebook page for Medical Media. We really are doing this because we want to be part of a wave, a movement in the world that shows how valid, how important metaphysical insight is to individuals, organizations, nations, the whole world. And you can really help us to do that by inviting your friends to like our page so that they hear about the shows. You can send links to the Blog Talk shows. You can just take a link off Blog Talk Radio and put it in your Facebook page or Twitter, whatever it is you want to use. So we would love you to help us get the word out and share the research work that we put out there, also our observations and discoveries about metaphysics. So please help us with that. Remember that we are planning to do a show every Friday. So we had a little bit of a blip last week. This is actually the show that we were going to do on Friday, but we will be doing our show 7 o'clock Eastern time. It is 7 Eastern, isn't it, Stephen, every week?
Yes, it is.
Yep.
7 to 9 every single week. God, we were absent Friday because my sister got married. Everybody can blame my sister for that. All 6 million of our listeners can blame my sister for getting married for that.
I think it was on CNN. I think that it said that, hitting the headlines that our radio show was interrupted.
Hey, you might joke. Event. You might joke, but we are a hit on the Greek island of Corfu. Okay, I'll just have you.
Are we?
Yeah, we're a hit. All 500.
How did you know that?
I just pulled it out of my butt. Never mind. I made it up. But I would like to...
I was going to say, I wasn't overly impressed with the Blog Talk Radio statistics or reporting, so I hadn't noticed the national breakdown.
They don't do the national break, at least not to my knowledge. But I would like to point out, and I am not pulling this out of my derriere, that, one thing we want Metaphysical Media Group to do, or to be, is a hub of educational resources for everybody. And, we're not arrogant about this. We're still learning things as well. And so we encourage you guys to write us in. Are we wrong? Do you think we're full of crap? Let us know. Try to be polite, please. Don't forget the courtesy your mom brought you up with, and we'll do the same. Now, I also want to point out that, if you find yourself maybe struggling to catch up a little bit, we're very sorry about that. We're going to try to work hard to make things clear, and pretty soon, don't worry, you'll understand a lot more about astrology. But Steve's written an excellent book called Thinking Completely Outside the Box, which is not only a wonderful primer on the basics of astrology, it's also a fascinating analysis of the Aurora, Colorado theater massacre involving James Egan Holmes on the screening of the Batman movie that happened, I want to say, in 2012. So hop over to Amazon.com and pick that book up post haste. You'll be very glad you did. It's a fascinating read, and it has a lot of interesting educational tidbits about astrology that'll help you keep up with some of the discussions we're having here. But eventually, we do envision this as being a huge cooperative educational gesture for the community, and we're going to have our website up, metaphysicalmediagroup.com, which will serve as a hub for all of the practice charts and study charts for anybody we discuss up here. And the same with our Facebook page, Metaphysical Media Group. I don't really have anything else to add aside from that. Steve, do you have anything?
No, just a reminder to people that if they want to have a reading in the second half of the show next week, please, if you can, if you want an astrological view, then make sure you've got your date of birth, obviously, which everyone can remember, but more importantly, have the time of birth if you can get it, because that enables us to get a really accurate view on who you are and what's going on in life and what's coming up. We can certainly help you a lot, and we look forward to that. And it's been fun, Stephen. I've had a great time, enjoyed the show, love working with you.
So have I. I really do appreciate it, and thanks to all of you at home who are listening, and we hope to see all of you guys this Friday, and we'll see you soon. Ciao.